Thank you, Ethan. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for letting me participate. So I wanted to tell you about two projects that we've done that led us to this concept and thinking about health of our public spheres and how we might measure. And then I will, for Claire's sake, mention the phrase fake news and then share with you two things that we're thinking about, two new directions which are really half-baked and I hope will lead to some feedback and maybe even some of you might be interested in helping us out. So this is the combined teams, both the Lab for Social Machines, which is based here at the Media Lab, and Cortica, which is a technology company that has its roots in the Lab for Social Machines, and we are kind of coordinating actions on some of the problems we work on. This is from our retreat last fall. I want to start with one project which was led by Soroush Vasugi, who's worked with me and in my lab for well over a decade now. He's a postdoc, but this is work that he did in his PhD. So going back to 2013, when the Boston Marathon was bombed, this is the first tweet, and as the Twitter sphere lit up with news and rumors, some of it true, some of it false, Soroush was actually in lockdown in Cambridge. Maybe some of you experienced this as well. I was with my family in Belmont. Never experienced this before. There's a manhunt for a couple of days through the streets of Boston, and we were in lockdown with our family in Belmont. So when the dust settled, and we were really relying heavily on Twitter as a source of information of what was happening in the moment. And you may recall there were a lot of what turned out to be false information. No, there was not a bomb in Harvard Square as well. No, it was not the Brown student that was the bomber. But there's also a lot of good information in the moment. And so when the dust settled, Soroush and I decided to ditch his thesis topic and completely change to ask the following question. This literally happened the week after the bombings. Can we predict the veracity of rumors? And the idea was, starting with some of the rumors that we experienced personally, to create a corpus of rumors, which were pieces of news that were being shared across Twitter, collect all the tweets that referred to each rumor, and then study different features of how the actual rumor was constituted, how it spread, and look at whether once the rumor was confirmed or denied by credible sources, fact-checking organizations or credible news sources, could we trace back in time and see any signal that could predict the ultimate veracity of the rumor. So this was in 2013 that we started this. And so we looked at different kinds of features that would feed into this predictive model. I'm not going to go in detail, but we looked at the language. So either expressions of opinion and insight, is there negation present, what's the level of formality and sophistication of the language being used. So there's linguistic features. We looked at the users that were involved in tweeting or retweeting about rumors. So we looked at whether the users were verified. We had a measure of originality, how much of their history is retweets versus original tweets, how controversial are the tweets in general from a source. So we're looking at the kind of mixture of sentiment of replies to those tweets. And finally, we looked at propagation properties of the rumor of the Twitter cascade. So if someone tweets, that's the original, the first blue node on the left, and then every time a tweet is retweeted, we would actually infer and reconstruct the full cascade and then look at various structural properties of how the cascade diffused. So when we combine all these features and create a predictive model, and I'm not going to take you into details of the model today, this is the final results that were published in 2015. And the way to read this is along the top is verification accuracy. We had about 200 rumors that we created as the test corpus that were balanced. Half turned out to be true, half turned out to be false, according to a set of sources that we relied on, which are all in the publications. 50% would therefore be chance performance. So what we found is by the time the first credible source confirmed or denied the rumor, which is shown in the red line, so this is normalized because different rumors, some would be confirmed or denied within hours, others would take days. So we normalized. What we found is indeed there is signal, there is predictive signal from each of these different classes of features before that first point of verification that we could find. And in particular, if you look at the black line, that is the combined ability to predict across all features. And when you break down, the most informative in the long term certainly is the propagation characteristics. It's kind of like a social signal of groups of people deciding which news or which piece of information to propagate. So that was, the intention here was, could we build a model and then maybe it'd be good for something? Maybe you could plug it in somehow into your information browsing experience and realize something might have questionable veracity based on the signals that the rumor's giving off. Then in roughly 2015, we started sort of phase 2 of this research with Sinan Aral, who's a faculty member in Sloan. And it led to the question, well, if propagation has this predictive quality, why don't we take a step back and ask the question, does the spread of true and false news differ, just as a sort of general descriptive study? And so, and this was led to Soroush then going to 6 fact-checking organizations and scraping all their data. And so we built a much larger corpus of contested news stories, and then went into the Twitter archives and pulled a comprehensive set of cascades, 126,000 cascades that span a decade. And all I'm able to do right now is show you a picture because this work, we're off by 3 days. So on Thursday, the embargo with Science Magazine will lift, so you'll be able to see the results. But this is actually a visualization of a pair, 2 of the 126,000 cascades that Peter Bashai at Cortico has visualized for us. He had a kind of poetic way of talking of the struggle of falsity and truth in this particular pair of cascades. Each link is a retweet that's inferred from the database. What we did find is what I'll say is a kind of stunningly different picture of the propagation properties. We did a lot of aggressive bot filtering to really understand what was the drivers, and we do conclude that this is a sort of human network behavior of this kind of differentiated diffusion. So on Thursday the embargo lifts and we'll be able to show the details, but I guess I'll just say that this is one example of what we started thinking about as a picture of what poor health of a part of the public sphere or spheres looks like when you actually have some kind of asymmetry between the spread of falsity and truth. So let me share a second example now of a project that we started, I guess, in around 2014. We're very much interested in understanding the relationship between social media and news, very similar to Yochai and Ethan's work. And so we set as a target within the world of news to look at a major event, the presidential election back in 2014. That seemed like a reasonable event that should give off some good signal. And in particular, we wanted to map what we call the horse race of ideas. Rather than looking at all the conversation that there inevitably will be in coverage around the horse race of who's going to win, we wanted to identify a set of issues and then look for both news coverage and social media, in particular Twitter, because we had full access to Twitter data to look at how people are talking about the elections. So there's a number of partners. Knight Foundation really came in a big way to support this effort, along with Twitter and many others. The kind of technical piece that was sort of the core of how we did the analysis was we trained a new kind of topic classifier. One of the challenges we ran into is if you take a issue like immigration or gun control, all of the hashtags and words and phrases that indicate that issue is being discussed evolve very rapidly. In particular, we found that when we trained kind of state-of-the-art models, our models would very quickly deteriorate in their accuracy. And so we did some interesting things just technically to mine new terms as they arose from topic tag news stories and from tweets themselves, and continuously retrained these models and found that we could get an accurate way to classify tweets at scale. Both find those tweets that were about the election, and then subclassify those into issues. And the primary goal during the election cycle was, along with developing some of these algorithms, to do some experiments, and this is where Knight's support was critical, to actually use this sort of Twitter listening as a complement to polling data, as another window into what people were thinking and talking about as the campaign ran its course. So we partnered with the Washington Post initially, and this was in December of 2015, the first example of this sort of data analysis, just showing over time the ebb and flow of attention across Twitter. This is all English language Twitter about the election, and you can see, of course, some general trends such as foreign policy, national security, immigration, and race related issues being the three top most talked about issues. That was not only true in December of 2015, but throughout the campaign. And there happened to be an unfortunate event, the San Bernardino shooting, and that spike in conversation about guns starts to give you a sense of, I'm sure many people are very familiar with this kind of analysis, that you have an exogenous event, and you can understand, given the San Bernardino shooting, there might have been race or immigration related growth of tweets, but it was really mainly registered in terms of guns. And so we, over the year, learned a lot about working with newsrooms, had a number of partners, did a bunch of writing ourselves, sort of just exercising this idea of mining tweets as a window. A lot of open questions around how to actually link or kind of make sense of this signal with respect to polling data where you have a representative sample. We're actually starting some work now in linking YouGov panel data with Twitter data, if anyone's interested. And we were also invited eventually by the Commission on Presidential Debates for the 3 presidential debates and the vice presidential debate to mine the Twitter data and essentially get a bottom-up set of patterns from which we could suggest questions that the moderators could ask the candidates. And so we briefed the moderators for each of those debates using that's actually our little printed debate brief book that we handed to each. Last thing I'll say about that project before I kind of show you my second picture of what bad or sort of poor health might look like. This is a breakdown over all of 2015 of the overall share of coverage and news of campaign finance. So we were running the same topic classifiers that we designed for tweets. We retrained to classify news stories, and we were tracking about 30 mainstream news sources, or let me say 30 news sources read by a lot of people, including Breitbart was in that list, and so forth. And what we found, this is just an example of actually the biggest contrast where there was more coverage on average throughout the year on campaign finance than there was talk on Twitter, according to our analytics and our topics. And the suggestion here is that this might we thought this could lead some journalists to rethink how they actually talk about the issue. There's no doubt in our minds, so I'll speak for myself, in my mind, that campaign finance is an important issue. But when I look at this kind of a gap, one needs to drill in to see the nuance. But maybe there's better ways to talk about campaign finance to spur more conversation on Twitter. In fact, I think Donald Trump did an incredible job of talking about campaign finance without ever uttering the phrase, by talking about being rigged and puppets, and everyone else on stage here are puppets. I know, I put money in their pockets. It was a very effective way to actually address a topic that I think a lot of others didn't get the right language to connect with a lot of the public. On the other hand, if you look at what is the biggest gap in the other direction, it is conversation about race in the context of the election, where we saw systematic undercoverage in the news with respect to what we saw on Twitter. So this has actually led to work that is happening in Cortico to actually mine not only Twitter, but various what we call ambient media sources in order to provide tools for journalists. We actually decided to focus on local journalism, to use ambient media as a way to discover stories that should be written or could be written differently based on these sort of analytics. So going back to the sort of the original data from the election, this is a visualization of a sample of about 1 million Twitter accounts that tweeted at least once about the US election during the summer of 2016. And we're just showing here the mutual follow, the nodes that have mutual follows between them, which tend to be accounts, if there's people behind them, that are more likely to know each other. So we're interested in kind of the social network behind people that are tweeting. Obviously, there's some structure and cliques within this network. Not so obvious is the relationship. They're color-coded by what topic they're tweeting about, less of a direct connection. However, when we recode this network based on what we started calling internally political tribes, we had a very simple definition. If an account only followed one of the candidates on either party that ran during the election, we call that an exclusive follower. And if we recolor this graph, then we see that there's actually a very obvious sort of correlation between political tribe membership. In red is the Trump tribe. These are accounts that only follow Donald Trump. Magenta, which is the biggest block, are actually accounts that follow Trump and Clinton. And then much more dispersed, but actually roughly similar in number to the Trump tribe. In blue are the Clinton tribe. And interestingly, this snapshot was taken after the primaries were over in the fall of 2016. So they were tweeting during the summer. The network snapshot was taken in the fall. There's a third roughly equal-sized tribe, and that's Sanders. And so we saw, immediately that there is a very fragmented left versus the right. The atrophied connections between the Trump tribe and the rest of the structure is really what we ended up sort of being most interested and sort of worried about, which is this kind of atrophied connection. Like this is a picture of a fragmented network. And if, regardless of what you believe about the interaction between tribes, and of course there's a lot of reasons to associate with a group and to be part of a tribe, but it was, if this was actually not just a snapshot, but on a sustained basis, we have a kind of fragmented network, that is another health indicator that is worth tracking, not just under this definition of tribes, but maybe in a more general way. One last thing we did, and by the way, we released this data. We worked with Vice News, and within a couple of days of this being published, we got a note back from Vice saying, hey, this just became our second most read piece of news in our history. So the amount of interest in just understanding what happened was obvious moments after. We were tracking news, so we found 30,000 journalists who had written at least one story about the US election, and we identified their personal accounts and located them on this map. In blue are the verified journalists, in yellow, the unverified. As Ethan's pointed out to me, hey Deb, it's not surprising that the journalists are not in the Trump tribe. We wouldn't even expect, perhaps, Breitbart journalists to only follow Trump. But it more just reinforces that where many of us build our understanding and get our narrative of what's happening across the country are sampling in a very non-uniform way from this structure. So. Okay, a quick comment, and actually I've taken too long, so I'm going to go fast. This is, I just love this Gallup poll that was run a couple of months ago, asking 19,000 Americans about media and trust. Just note, 19,000 Americans were asked, do each of these count as what they think of as the meaning of fake news? So the first is people knowingly portraying false information as if it were true. Majority of Americans think that that is sometimes or always an example of fake news. I think that's not surprising. The second, accurate stories casting a politician or a political group in a negative light. The majority of Americans sometimes or always also consider that to be an example of fake news. So I think of this as a couple concepts. It's not that we're confused. It's just two different senses of the phrase. And I think it's not accidental. The relationship between a fragmented communication commons creating sort of the enabling conditions for alternate realities to persist. They're clearly coupled, and I think it's even there in the definition of how everyday Americans are referring. So I mentioned I'd leave you with tell you about two things we're starting off. One is this notion of given some segmentation of tribes or groups in a network, can we define a set of principles by which we can think about health indicators? We use health indicators to say like your cholesterol level or your heart rate, they are grounded in some reality, in that terms, what's happening in your body. How you interpret cholesterol may change as you understand the context in which the measurement's been taken as research unfolds, and yet it's an indicator that has some kind of clear grounding and is worth tracking and understanding. So in that sense, we have defined 4 principles, and this came out of a lot of discussion. I co-led a seminar called Depolarization by Design. Some of the people in this room participated. I'm not saying they signed off on these principles, but they informed our thinking. Shared attention, is there overlap when we talk about 2 tribes, attentional spotlights? If those spotlights never overlap, they're always pointing at different parts of the world. Or sort of the domains of discourse. We think that's something worth tracking. Shared reality, are we using the same facts? This is separate from have those facts been fact-checked, but is there even reference to the same facts, or even if we both care about immigration, are we actually referring to completely different sets of reference points? If we do have alignment of attention and reference points, do we actually have exposure to other perspectives? When I think something happened is good, the fact that it's bad news for Ethan, am I ever exposed to that varied perspective of what the meaning of that event or shared facts are? And finally, if I am having exposure, what's the nature of that exposure? Am I open, civil, am I listening, or am I dismissive? Am I attacking? And a lot of that we think can be seen through the kinds of discourse and linguistic patterns. So these are 4 principles, and what we're doing now is actually trying to build, prototype metrics for each of these. And we're not just doing it with Twitter. We certainly continue to work with Twitter, but we are expanding to a variety. In fact, here's the list. We are now investing in setting up talk radio ingest and analytics. We have done a lot of work in television in the past that we'll return to, and we have started dabbling with Facebook and Reddit and online news you've seen in the past. So we think it's important to also have concepts that can carry at least partly across these different platforms. Okay, so what is the theory of action? So what if we have some health indicators? If you have health indicators and no one is paying attention, it's not much point. So one possibility is content distributors may actually use such indicators as a benchmark. There are ways to actually, I think from the outside of a platform, give some kind of a map of where healthy and unhealthy behavior is happening. And some of you might have seen, this was last week, Jack Dorsey tweeted, "We're committing Twitter to help increase the collective health, openness, and civility of public conversation and hold ourselves publicly accountable towards progress." Somehow this 3rd tweet in the tweet storm is the biggest because it's my favorite. So he refers to the work that I just took you through as helping frame how Twitter is thinking now about health of the conversation on their platform. And it's a loose coupling. They're very aware of what we're doing. It's helping them frame how they might think about it internally. But we are sitting outside of Twitter and looking at some of the data, and we'll start prototyping across different platforms, including Twitter, this kind of indicator. And we're talking to other platforms along the same lines. Content producers, it turns out polarization is a great business model. Whether you're CNN or Fox or anyone else, this kind of fragmented communication commons is actually can be profitable. We have some relationships already with content producers. We work with Frontline. We work with McKinsey's Media and Entertainment Group. The we here is on the MIT side. And we believe there may be some ways to at least get a little bit of traction with a second set of ways to keep score of how content producers are doing beyond reach and ad revenue. And then there's, of course, advertising. I'm just naming 5 stakeholder groups, for each of whom one could imagine health indicators having some impact. If advertisers had a systematic way to know where the public conversation was healthy versus unhealthy, that could certainly be a guide to where one wants to put their dollars. A very interesting 4th group, and I think should be separate and broken out from content producers, are individual influencers who, of course, have huge followings, do produce content themselves, but separate from content producers, which are organizations, are individuals, and can actually optimize for things other than fan base and dollars for tweeting about merchandise and so forth. So we think, imagine a leaderboard of local talk radio show hosts who are having the most positive impact in the part of the public's conversation they touch. Imagine breaking out a leaderboard for the left and the right. Is it impossible to spur a race to the top? We're going to experiment. And finally, what about the people? I think I'm a little skeptical of health indicators turning into some kind of media literacy feed for a few billion people. I think there's some interesting possibilities there, but I want to take, now that I'm over time, my last 2 minutes to just tell you about something we're doing. One of the people that was in that picture is someone named Kathy Kramer, and we think to have deep impact in how people are actually potentially able to communicate across tribes, it's important to not just look at the mediated space, but go back to human-human interactions. Kathy wrote a remarkable book. I'm not going to tell you about it because I'm out of time, but it's called The Politics of Resentment. Her method, fascinating, is to go discover coffee clutches in rural Wisconsin, invite herself in, prompt a open-ended question, and then just listen. And record the conversations, and then do conversational pattern analysis. This book is prescient. She wrote it during the rise of Scott Walker and the election of Barack Obama. If you want to understand how rural Wisconsin is thinking about Donald Trump, I can't think of a better book. And her concept of rural consciousness, this completely different worldview, just hundreds of miles from Madison and Milwaukee, is captured in this book. So what we're doing with Kathy is thinking about how to scale up her methods without taking the human out of the human-human listening loop. So the first time we're showing this publicly. This is the what we call the listening box. It says there, why do you work? There's a button, press to record, it records. There's also going to be audio curation and playback. In the back end, speech and network analytics that the Media Lab team is working on. This is a map. Every white dot is a public library. There's about 20,000 of them. So what would happen if we could figure out how to recruit human listeners who owned and facilitated conversation around these listening boxes? And if we wanted to give it a fanciful name, what would a listening core of America look like? So Kathy is going to be spending her sabbatical with us starting in a few months. We've already got these prototypes, and we're going to start doing experiments in libraries, working with Jeff Jarvis and CUNY, doing a variant with one of these listening boxes in Mahaven. So we think there's a longer horizon way to have deeper impact if you can actually start to create a way to surface voices, and this is my final slide, that as we track, whether it's working with influencers who can put a spotlight on underheard voices, whether it's working with media organizations with platforms, or perhaps directly going on the ground to surface underheard voices and stories and create lateral bridges between groups. That's sort of the strategy that we're following. And if it's working, hopefully we'll have some metrics that will actually let us know when we move the needle. Thank you, and apologies for going over time.
I think, Deb, you've just established the rule, which is if you're being as supremely helpful as you just were, you can get away with going over time. Is there a quick question for Deb before we bring up Peter? There's going to be lots of time to talk over lunch and such, but let's see if we can get a quick question right now. Jay Stray, we're going to get you to introduce yourself first.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Stray. I teach computational journalism at Columbia. Um, so I've heard this, we want journalists to give attention to things that are undercovered many times before. Um, my students have estimated that our algorithmic filtering systems reduce the volume of information by somewhere between 10 to the 6 and 10 to the 8, meaning that almost everything is undercovered. How do you decide which of these millions of stories are worthy?
I don't know what it means for everything to be undercovered when campaign finance, by our very simple brute metric, is overcovered, maybe 3 to 1. If the question is, what does under versus overcovered mean? When I showed those two graphs, I was trying to be careful in saying the way to interpret and what to do with that graph, even that pair, are different. In one case, the fact that very few people, if interest and attention of people who use Twitter is reflected by what proportion of their tweets are about that topic, it appears that people on Twitter are not very interested in campaign finance when they were discussing the election. It appears that if you look at volume of coverage by journalists are far more interested. I think it's a good reason why journalists were trying to bring more attention to that topic. The gap, and one would have to look at what exactly was being said, but this is gut, not data. Journalists didn't know how to talk about it. Using the phrase campaign finance, they should have taken a lesson out of a page out of Trump's language for how to talk about it. My friend Larry Lessig tried to focus attention on that. I watched how he talked about it and the engagement he got, and then I watched Donald Trump talk about it. So I think understanding why is there that gap, and obviously a journalist and editor deciding, do they care about that gap, but are they even aware of it? I don't think many are. That was our experience from working with newsrooms. On the other side, if there wasn't an unarmed black man being shot, which is what each of the spikes, the main spikes around the press coverage around race issues as it related to the elections, there was a much higher baseline of conversation on Twitter. Some of it was horrible stuff. Some of it was meaningful. And there may be themes there which aren't event-driven, but are just consistently undercovered. So I think a thoughtful mining and interpretation of this data to decide, are there stories we could be telling that would be more responsive to what's on the minds of people who may pay more attention to us, may value us more if we did it. That's sort of the, I feel strongly about that.
Jonathan, methodologically, you're also bumping into one of the challenges that over in our lab with Media Cloud we've had enormous problems with, which is essentially saying, can we give you a picture of what the whole news agenda is and how it might change over time? It turns out it's often a lot easier to sort of say, let's find everything on this one topic than to sort of say, let's get a whole picture of what the New York Times or Twitter is talking about and sort of get that stacked graph that Deb was showing. That one turns out to be really complicated to do for a bunch of methodological reasons. But trying to figure out that question of what is that current picture of how topic breakdown happens, and what would it mean to have the right or the healthy distribution of it. That's in the sphere of questions that I want to be answering, but I have sort of no big prayer of answering anytime soon. Can we hear it once more for Deb, please?